Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Blue Boar Tavern. My name's Tom Woosnam. I'm often known as not Jonathan Dixon. Jonathan will be out of town for a few weeks, so I am going to try and step into his very big shoes and host this particular episode anyway of the Blue Boar Tavern. Again, welcome. And there's Phoebe Nir. Good to see you.
Oh, how are you doing?
It's been a long, long time. Great to see you. You've
It's
been
wonderful to see you too.
great. Yeah, those old days when I was one of the people there in the bar instead of behind the bar.
You're back working.
I'm working, exactly, yeah. And I think we've got Alex joining us. There he is.
Oh my God, dressed to kill. Alex McNeil.
The dapper Alex. Good to see you, my friend.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Bonner cutting.
Bonner.
And Dorothea Dickerman. Fabulous. Hi, Dorothea.
Hey,
Welcome.
everybody. Hey, Tom.
Oh, wonderful to see you. Great to be back.
Alex, Phoebe.
Hey.
Good, like old home week.
It is.
So I, as I said, I'm going to try and do my best to fill Jonathan's shoes. I know, because I know all four of you, if I mess up, you're going to correct me and keep me back on track here. What I want to do before we dive into the program itself is to give a little bit of background to the Blue Boar Tavern and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, because some of you may be seeing this for the very first time. Some of you may discover it on YouTube. So background, Blue Boar Tavern, brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. We have a website. It's very creatively named. It's called the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship.org. And I highly encourage all of you to poke around in it, learn some stuff, in particular about what we call the SAQ, which is short for the Shakespeare authorship question. So those of you who stumble on this on YouTube are thinking, oh my goodness, tinfoil hat wearers. What Shakespeare authorship question? We all know who wrote the works of Shakespeare. Pick up a biography, take a Shakespeare class at college or high school. Why would we even question this in the first place? Well, it basically is very simple in that the idea that it was the man from Stratford is a posthumous creation. That is, there are some 70 plus documents about the man from Stratford, and not one of them, zero, zip, none of them link him in any way with authorship of any particular kind. Now, I think that for most people might be, well, that's kind of weird. Maybe we could sort of follow that. And some of you might also be saying, well, it's not a surprise. When we're talking 400 years ago, crying out loud, stuff gets lost. All the connections have gone in some fashion. Unfortunately, no, that doesn't work either, because we have 24 contemporaries of the man from Stratford, going from, say, will be Christopher Marlowe to Ben Jonson, for whom we have what's known as a literary paper trail. So this chap from Stratford is unique amongst all authors, if you want to call him an author, in that there is nothing in his lifetime that links him to the art of writing. His friends never talked about him as a writer. Nobody did at all. So let's imagine then you're on the site. That's why it's a Shakespeare authorship question, and I'm just touching the surface right here. But it's the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. So what's the Oxford got to do with it? All of us here in this meeting, if you will, know that there is such a large body of work associated with Edward de Vere, which is incredibly compelling that he himself could be considered to be the author. And that's where we're coming from with this. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't take other points of view into account. And that's why we're having this discussion this evening. But I want us to sort of set the scene also with something that Ros Barber from Goldsmiths College, University of London says, which is that when it comes to the authorship question, there are always alternative candidates. She said that at our last conference, and it really sat well with me. Just as we might be so convinced that it's our guy, there are people who are just convinced it's their guy or their gal, whatever. So that's the background as I see this program right now. So the two people we're going to talk about, or rather you all are going to talk about, and I'm going to listen and learn some stuff, we're going to start out with Christopher Marlowe. And I just want to say a little bit about Marlowe, just to reveal my almost complete ignorance to everybody. There is a book called The Reckoning by Charles Nicholl. Alex, you're probably going to mention this. Everybody read that book. It is a page turner. It certainly changed my mind when I thought about the traditional description of Marlowe. So there's my first plug, my first little bit of sort of background to Marlowe. My second is that I've just finished taking a course here just outside the Boar Tavern that's called Shakespeare and Marlowe. And the conceit is that the man from Stratford, who we call Shakespeare, because his name was never spelled in personal documents with an E after the K, that Shakespeare and Marlowe worked together on plays. And I wasn't terribly convinced by that, but here's what was amazing to me. For the first time ever, I looked at, along with the teacher, it was Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, and Edward II, and written by Marlowe. Oh my goodness, that guy could write. I was gobsmacked. I mean, he could almost be a modern writer. The prose flows so well. You want to turn the pages. He creates real characters. This was a solid guy, and I had no idea. All right, enough of me rambling. Alex, going to throw you a very hard question. This chap, Marlowe, died in 1593, aged 29, when he was stabbed in a lodging house in Deptford. Why are we even considering he might be an alternate author?
That's a good question, Tom. I'm glad you asked that question. That is really the key question, and that is the linchpin of really the case for Marlowe as a strong alternative candidate of who wrote the works for Shakespeare, is that he did not die in May 1593, that the reports of his death were, shall we say, exaggerated, if not completely made up. At the beginning, I should say, I am not an expert on Christopher Marlowe at all, but I have done some research about him, and a couple of things I wanted to underscore that you said. Yes, the few plays that exist that are attributed to him, which are 6, are renowned for their depth and for their characterization and for their style. Marlowe is considered as really advancing the Elizabethan drama toward a new era. He might not have been the sole person to do that, but he was certainly one of the leaders in moving it forward in terms of an art. You alluded to the scorecard of evidence that we have about other writers, and you were referring to Diana Price's book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, where she has a chart of how Shakespeare of Stratford lines up against 24 other contemporary writers. Shakespeare, as we all know, scores a 0. He has none of the 10 corroborating factors. Ben Jonson is at the other end. He has all 10 of the corroborating factors that would prove him to be a writer. Marlowe is kind of in the middle. His score is only 4 out of 10. Namely, there's evidence that he had an education, that he had a relationship with the patron. There are miscellaneous records referring to him as a writer, and notice at the time of his death, or his quote death, as a writer. Those are the 4 criteria. A brief bio of what we do know: he was baptized in Canterbury, Kent in February 1564, excuse me. So he's just about the same age as Shakespeare of Stratford. He died or disappeared on May 30th, 1593, at the age of 29. There's no record that he was ever married or that he had any children. We do know that he was educated, and that puts him a step ahead of Shakespeare of Stratford. He attended King's School in Canterbury, a good grammar school, and then from there he went to Corpus Christi College at Cambridge University. And according to William Rubinstein in his book, Who Wrote Shakespeare's Plays, that came out about 10 or maybe 15 years ago, he, quote, had a reputation for violent affrays and the questioning of authority. We also know that he must have performed some kind of government-sanctioned work in France in the mid-1580s. At about the same time, he was enrolled as a student at Corpus Christi College. The Cambridge University authorities in the late 1580s were not going to award him his degree because they were concerned about some lengthy absences that he'd taken from school. And they also feared that he might have been planning to flee to France to become a Roman Catholic or possibly even a Roman Catholic priest. However, the Privy Council advised the university in writing before the degree ceremony that Christopher Marlowe, quote, had done Her Majesty good service, quote, in matters touching the benefit of his country. And that persuaded the Cambridge University authorities to go ahead and grant him the degree. So that's certainly a very interesting notification that was not a private notification. That's my understanding. As we said, he's known for 6 plays, none of which bore his name until after the year of his death or disappearance, after 1593. Some of them, they're known to have been published, but there's no existing quartos. I think the earliest existing quarto we have of some is 1594. He also wrote some other literary works, including poetry, and he also translated some poetry. According to Rubinstein, in Rubinstein's book, as I said, Who Wrote Shakespeare's Plays, the 4 factors in favor of his authorship are: he was hailed as a great writer. He was lauded by Ben Jonson and Peele and Drayton and Nash, among other people. He certainly was well qualified because he had a college education. He had government connections. He participated in the theater world. He had traveled. We know that he was in France at least once during his lifetime. And as Rubinstein says succinctly, quote, he wrote like Shakespeare. And as a matter of fact, in 1790, Shakespeare biographer Edmund Malone proposed that Marlowe had written Titus Andronicus. So beliefs even among traditional scholars that Marlowe is somehow involved in all this go way back. They go back more than 200 years. Back to Rubinstein, the principal arguments against his authorship: 1, he died in 1593, unless he didn't die. More about that in a minute. Rubinstein also says his style is different. Even though his style is very good and he's a good writer, his style is different from Shakespeare's style. One of the points Rubinstein makes especially is that Marlowe coined a lot fewer new words than Shakespeare did. Also, Rubinstein asks, if Marlowe had written Shakespeare, why isn't his name on some of the early works attributed to Shakespeare, like Henry VI or Richard II? And even if he did survive after 1593 and somehow went to the continent, the practical difficulties involved in sensing what the London theater community would have wanted or needed, the lack of direct knowledge of current political activities back home, and just the logistics of getting manuscripts and other information back and forth from the continent to England are, especially in those days, are very, very strong obstacles. But back to answer your question, at least I think that was your question, did he die on May 30th, 1593? That's the fascinating question. And as I said, the linchpin to the case for Marlowe. In 1925, Shakespeare scholar Leslie Hodson found the report of the official inquest that was held right after Marlowe's supposed death. According to the official report, Christopher Marlowe and 3 other men, guys named Fraser, Skeers and Poley were at Mrs. Bull's house, which I think was sort of a tavern in Deptford, all day on May 30th, 1593, mostly talking in the garden. They came indoors late in the day, and a quarrel broke out about settling the bill, also known as, yes, the reckoning. According to the report, Marlowe was lying on a couch or a bed while the other three were seated at a nearby table, Fraser having his back to Marlowe. During the dispute, according to the report, Marlowe grabbed Fraser's dagger, which was in the back of his belt, and stabbed Fraser in the head. In the ensuing struggle, Fraser got the dagger back and stabbed Christopher Marlowe in the eye, a deep wound in the eye, killing him instantly. The coroner's inquest verdict, Fraser acted in self-defense and would not be prosecuted, received a pardon. What do we know about Fraser, Skeers, and Poley? All of them were government agents. All of them were closely connected to the Walsingham family for lengthy periods of time, not just brief encounters. Doubts about the inquest report raged in the 20th century after Hodgson discovered it in 1925, boosting Marlowe's candidacy. What are the options if we think about it? Well, it could be accurate. It could be a report of what actually happened, and that there was some kind of quarrel, and that Marlowe was stabbed in self-defense. It's also possible that Marlowe could have died that day, but under different circumstances. Rubinstein, I believe, believes it's unlikely that he was ordered to be killed because the government, Elizabeth's government, was not really known for assassinations that way. If they'd really wanted to get rid of Marlowe, they could have charged him with atheism and been able to kill him legally. The other option, of course, is it could all be a cover-up to make it appear that Christopher Marlowe had indeed died. And this goes back to Marlowe's previous known foreign service in France, for which he received the excuse from the Privy Council allowing him to get his degree. It's assumed that other spies, foreign spies in England, would have heard about that. They would have learned about the message from the Privy Council about his service to his country. They would have realized that Marlowe was a British spy, and that would have blown his cover. So if the government reported that Marlowe had actually died, Marlowe could conceivably have been sent on another foreign mission under another name and identity. Something I've often wondered to myself is, how did people prove their identity back in those days when there's no photographs, no driver's licenses, nothing like that? It is possible. Gilbert Slater, in his book, 7 Shakespeares, I don't know if you can see it very well in this, maybe you can't see it at all, but anyway, I am holding the book. Gilbert Slater, in his book, 7 Shakespeares, he hypothesized that Marlowe's death was faked. He thinks that Fraser, Skeers, and Poley, the 3 guys connected with Walsingham, were in Deptford for several days in late May 1593 until a suitable corpse turned up, a man who was be about the same age and size as Marlowe. As soon as they found the corpse, they summoned Marlowe to Deptford and dressed the corpse up in Marlowe's clothes. Marlowe presumably was given another set of clothes and was able to disappear. Slater also thought that if Marlowe did leave England in mid-1593, that he may never have returned. The other problem is, even if he did return, he would have had to create a new identity because he'd already been declared officially dead, officially and publicly dead. Let me just wrap up a couple of things. There's 2 very intriguing possible references to Marlowe, both in Shakespeare's As You Like It. There's a line from Marlowe's poem, Hero and Leander, that was published in 1598, about 5 years after his death or disappearance. And then secondly, there's Touchstone's famous line, when a man's verses cannot be understood, it strikes him more dead than a great reckoning in a little room, referring quite possibly to the settling the bill quarrel back at the Mrs. Bull's house in Deptford. Marlowe is credited as being responsible for 6 plays. Dido, Queen of Carthage, published in 1594, although the title page there says that it's by Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Nash, but Thomas Nash's name is in smaller type below Christopher Marlowe's. Tamburlaine Parts 1 and 2, they are referenced in 1587, printed in 1590 with no author's name. The Jew of Malta, performed in 1592, and a very popular play, popular for the next 50 years until the theaters were closed, was entered in the Stationer's Register in 1594, but the earliest known existing quarto is not until 1633. Dr. Faustus, performed as early as 1589. Edward II, published in 1594 with Marlowe's name on it. And The Massacre at Paris, an undated first publication, probably in 1594. And finally, speaking of collaboration, in 2017, the New Oxford Shakespeare, edited by Gary Taylor and others, proposed that Shakespeare's play Henry VI was a Shakespeare-Marlowe collaboration.
Terrific. I'm beginning to understand how difficult Jonathan's job is, because I'm looking at all these wonderful comments here. I've got a question that's going to refer to Bacon coming up. I'm also keeping an eye on the time because we want to divide this equally.
Tom, I have a point.
Yes, jump in.
Thank you, Alex. That was so much fun to listen to. The one thing it's interesting. Marlovians have had a pretty exciting time since that 2016 New Oxford Shakespeare coup, where I think it was AI was determining that, they were reading this play and seeing Marlowe's hand in it. So an explanation that I've come across for that, because I get that question a lot, is Robert Prechter. He actually says that what happened was Christopher Marlowe dies, Edward de Vere has money, and so he wants to publish posthumously. He wants to put out Marlowe's works, and so he has to add little bits here and there to kind of wrap things up. And so when AI is reading these plays, it's reading Christopher Marlowe's canon, and it's seeing Shakespeare contributing to Marlowe's plays, including that line in Hero and Leander. And then that's why AI is saying, oh, I'm reading Shakespeare, and it's that same hand is present in that. So actually, Bob Prechter just launched a YouTube channel, Oxford's Voices. So I think that would be a good video for him to do if he's talking about Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare.
Great.
There's also another little interesting twist that if Nash is Oxford, then what you're actually seeing is Oxford putting Nash's name underneath Marlowe's name for the plays that Oxford finished for him or edited for him. I think that Bob thinks that Dido, Queen of Carthage, that Marlowe did the first 2 acts, and that Nash, as Oxford, finished 3, 4, and 5, and then did some edits in 1 and 2. For me, that makes a lot of sense, because I find a Nash one of those characters that I don't really think he's material. There's not enough historical facts about him. There are too many gaps. I'm pretty sure he's a pseudonym for someone. And also there's that sort of, wonderful Virgil passages in the Aeneid about Dido and Carthage, which, clearly Oxford knew a very great deal about and used throughout the plays that surround Sicily and the peninsula of Italy that he wrote.
It's very interesting. I just found out, today when I was looking at trying to find some of the title pages of the quartos, to see by Christopher Marlowe in big type, and then Anne Thomas Nash.
And Thomas Nash, yes.
Small type. Now, Elizabethan readers were very astute. They would have drawn some inference from that very fact. It wasn't that the printer ran out of the type that he had to use a different typeface. Come on. Mm-hmm. These things are all meaningful, and the audience at the time would have paid some attention to that fact.
They would have. And one more thing I just want to make clear is that none of Marlowe's plays were published during his lifetime. 0. So it's not like he's been turning out plays and then he gets stabbed. And then, all of his manuscripts had to go to someone to be, assembled and edited and taken. And who was that someone?
Mhm.
I've also, sorry, Bonner, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just didn't know we're having such a wonderful discussion. I don't want to, I just want to point out while we're still talking about Marlowe, that there's a wonderful pamphlet that's now available on the internet by Stephanie Hopkins Hughes. If you haven't run across it, it's called The Great Reckoning, Who Killed Christopher Marlowe and Why? And I won't go into it because you can read it on the internet. It's there several places, but she has a wonderful comment that is very appropriate for a lot of things. And I just love it. So I'm going to read it to you. She writes about Nicole's book that Alex told us about, which has really it kind of blows me away. It's almost too much information, TMI, and Nicole. I lose track of it, who's who, because so many people are coming and are going, and these are great people. They're all kind. Well, I won't go into that, but this is what Stephanie has to say. Nicole, so diligent in uncovering evidence, reveals a sorry weakness when it comes to interpreting it. I could say that for a lot of historians. She also thinks, and this is her, I read from her, that when she discusses the prospect of an assassination, that assassination of someone who at the time was under investigation by the mighty Star Chamber, because as Alex knows, he was called in to report to the Privy Council at this time when he's going to be, and of course he ends up shuffling off the mortal coil somehow, maybe, or at least leaving the building somehow. I wrote that in one of my articles. Marlowe left the building, and I got a good laugh out of that. But that she writes that it would certainly require orders from the highest level. So that's just from Stephanie Hughes, who is somebody we all admire a great deal, and you can get this. It's on her Politic War, but so just take a look at it at some point, and because it's also shorter and more succinct with information than Nicole's book, which I actually liked a lot. But it's you got to wade through it, right? Is that right, Alec? it's a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
Well, I've also seen some comments, people asking or talking about the Edward de Vere hated Marlowe because of his atheism. I've seen that Alexander Watt presentation as well. I do think that he's conflating the Lord Strange with Edward de Vere in that situation. I don't think that episode actually happened with Oxford, but I don't think it's worth delving into while we're about to transition.
Right.
Real quick, until I was reading again at the Nicole book, which I read eons ago, and had forgotten what. I'd forgotten about the connection between Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Watson. And Thomas Watson is a big connection to Oxford. So, and in fact, they were in prison together. There was, because Marlowe got into trouble from time to time, and he got into a fray with, he's in the Shoreditch district, and somebody whose name I've got here comes out to attack him, and Thomas Marlowe, that is, and Thomas Watson intercedes and kills the person. And they're immediately both arrested, both imprisoned at Newgate Prison, I think. And within 2 weeks, Marlowe, you can read this in the book, but at any rate, this is really pretty tough stuff because they are obviously together in this event, and two people post bond for Marlowe to get out of prison, and then Watson has to go to trial and actually it's in Nicole's book. I won't go through it anymore, but this is really quite a mess. And
I'm going to turn into a bouncer at this point, guys.
Okay.
It's nothing personal, Bonner, you know that. It's approaching the midway point.
Sure.
We have another candidate. So Francis Bacon, brilliant philosopher, scientist, polymath. Phoebe Nir, tell us more.
All right. Well, I have a slightly less sunny view of, I'm like, did Francis Bacon pay to say all that stuff, Tom? All right. So I'm going to give what is hopefully a concise spiel that I'm calling The Talented Mr. Bacon, which is a riff on The Talented Mr. Ripley, which is a Hollywood movie starring Matt Damon. Matt Damon plays the kind of nefarious young man who falls in love with his benefactor, the sort of playboy, hot-headed, rich kid, Jude Law. And Matt Damon is obsessed with him, and he kind of ends up infatuated with him, murders him, and then steals his life. So let's hold that in the back of our minds as I'm talking a little bit about Francis Bacon, but not literally. So Bacon, he's 11 years younger than de Vere. He's actually closely related by marriage because he's actually William Cecil, Lord Burleigh's nephew by marriage. So Bacon's, born into the aristocracy, and again, is closer in age to Will of Stratford. So I think to the question of like, why did people think, because he had this reputation as this sort of eccentric, brilliant guy who was sort of proximal to Lord Burleigh, aka Polonius, and also, in the right place at the right time, if you're thinking that the dating should correlate to Will of Stratford's lifespan. So I think that was why and also a reference to, I'm just getting that question out of the way, that he wrote about ciphers. And so that was, I think, why he was such a hit in the Victorian era as an alternative Shakespeare candidate. But anyway, that is besides the point of what I'm going to be talking about. So he's sort of this like nutty professor, weird, eccentric, geeky guy. And his lifelong single-minded obsession is that he wants to be the head of a government-funded laboratory in the style of the Manhattan Project. That is what he's obsessed with his entire life. And so he kind of wants to be like Robert Oppenheimer. And despite our he was a lawyer and a prosecutor and a politician, but he actually had a lot of disdain for that. When he was young, he thought he was just going to be this amazing scientist. And he said the practice of law is a refuge for the poor and the friendless. But the joke was a little bit on him because he would spend a lot of time practicing law. So early in his career, he shows up at court and he produces a masque in which he asks Queen Elizabeth for funding for his amazing kind of laboratory in which we'll have he needs a perfect library and an herbarium and a laboratory for alchemy. And he has sort of a cute line, which he says, if he gets all these things, then he'll be able to perform hundreds of miracles. And she herself, i.e. Queen Elizabeth, will be the only miracle and mystery of the world left unexplored and ununderstandable, which is cute. But she's a practical gal and she is not buying it, because if you ask him what he wants to invent, he kind of gives you this like fire hose answer where it's just everything. And we're going to cure all diseases and we're going to suck the rain out of the clouds through a straw and alchemy. And we're going to fly all around. And so he can't articulate what exactly his goals are. He's just so big picture. And so he strikes out. He ends up going to law school by default. Oops. And when he finishes law school, he hires a bunch of lab assistants to work under him. And he borrows a lot of money, and this is kind of a catastrophe. He does this for 10 years and he's so bad at managing money. You get the sense that he has this sort of like anxiety around it. Like he just doesn't want to look at the books. He doesn't want to know how it's going. He kind of can't face it. And he also alienates his most powerful connection, his uncle, Lord Burleigh, basically by saying that it's plain that the work of statesmen lasts but for a short time, but the work of inventors is felt everywhere and lasts forever. So he's very self-aggrandizing and very arrogant, but doesn't have the track record or the success to show it off. And meanwhile, he's still involved in parliament, but he's a really bad public speaker. He's unpolished, he's sweaty, he's short of breath. People describe his speech as panting and laboring, and he ends up making his own causes toxic because he gets overexcited and he goes too hard and he's a disaster. And at this point, he needs a hero to save him. And who steps in but his cousin, Robert Cecil. And so Robert Cecil comes in and starts to groom him and helps him to be a more delicate courtier with less brash manners. And he writes him a letter and he says, you need to stop to be attempting to be an inventor of, quote, all things possible, which is funny that he's describing it like you're trying to invent literally everything. Instead, be a lawyer, do it well. And actually, he takes advice from his cousin, Robert Cecil. And so he says, he starts to kind of do this. And this is why I kind of get back to this talented Mr. Ripley motif, is he starts to kind of groom himself to transform himself. He knows that he's awkward. He's, quote, more fit to hold a book than play a part, but he realizes that he's alienated the Queen and Lord Burleigh and they're not going to give him money. So he needs to become stone cold rich and he needs to succeed and climb the ladder. And so he takes on this regimen where he's teaching himself how to lie better, how to be more likable, less off-putting. And he creates this notebook where anytime somebody says something cool or hip or funny at court, he's writing it down and he's like practicing saying cool, funny things at court. And people start to like him better. And so interestingly, this is, you hear a lot about him as like the father of empiricism. Interestingly, his first successful application of empiricism is through intelligence and spying. So the Earl of Essex wants to make a spy network that can rival Lord Burleigh's. And so he brings on Bacon to be his guy, which is interesting because Bacon has totally turned his back on his former, uncle, so that's interesting. And so Bacon says that intelligence is too inexact and it's too poetical for my taste. And he says the Spanish Armada was partly because of failed intelligence, because the Spanish were so confident that the Catholics in England would support them and they got bad intel. Bacon says this is trash. We need multiple confirmatory data points. We need multiple corroborating witnesses, because to rely on one piece of witness, one witness or one piece of information to make a decision is like a foolish mountebank making a urinalysis on only one water. So it's like that's the birth of, you're witnessing the birth of modern empiricism, is Bacon saying that, if you only have one spy telling you what to do, it's like trying to get a mountebank using only one urine. So that's what he was talking like a weird guy. So I don't think much of his spying career. He seems to just frame a lot of people. There's the Rodrigo Lopez, the doctor, who ends up, I think, being falsely accused of treason, and he dies. Also later in his career, Francis Bacon is going after Walter Raleigh and this really ugly kangaroo. He becomes like this kind of puppet guy who will just go after people. Almost like a McCarthy. I don't know enough about McCarthy to claim the comparison, but he's just there when you need somebody to frame somebody and go after them. Okay, so basically he's working with the Earl of Essex, and this is where I'm starting to say he seems to develop this kind of obsession fixation with him, where he's being very controlling and weird, and he's constantly sort of critiquing him, but saying like, be closer to me, do what I'm telling you to do. You're so great, but why do you do this with the other people? Why are you hanging out with these other people? Like, very weird. And the Earl of Essex is a volatile, arrogant character who has no interest in this. And so I think that insults Bacon, who basically decides he's going to publicly renounce him and switch back to the Cecil faction. And unfortunately, it's kind of bad timing, because the Earl of Essex is about to have huge triumph and become even more popular and successful. And so then Bacon comes back and is buzzing around him, telling him to stay humble. And he's telling everyone around, oh, I really like him, but he's so arrogant. Like, it's weird. And so then Essex does the thing where he storms into Queen Elizabeth's rooms, and he gets on the wrong side of Queen Elizabeth. And actually, Bacon at this point tries to intercede to get Elizabeth to forgive him and restore him, saying that Essex should be tried publicly and then restored to honor. And Queen Elizabeth doesn't do this initially, but ultimately this is what ends up happening. And Bacon presides over the trial over his former benefactor and friend. And he says it's his intention to mask the fact that he's still loyal to Essex throughout the trial. And he succeeds extremely well at this, because afterwards he becomes almost like, when clips go viral of like, in Congress where you have like somebody prosecuting a witness, or, those clips, like he becomes the face of attacking Essex and saying he's a terrible person and he's treasonous, and very publicly hostile. Afterwards, he's libeled by and hated by all of Essex supporters. But he kind of tries to slither back to Essex, and he's like, I didn't mean it. And he tells Elizabeth that, now we've drawn out all the ill humors from Essex, so you should comfort him and aid him, because your current course is more likely to corrupt him than to reform him. And so then he does this crazy thing, and I'm getting towards the end here. He approaches Essex and he says, let me ghost write letters from you to the Queen, because you're hot-headed, but I know how to assuage her. So I'll write wonderful things from you to the Queen. And Essex is like suspicious of his intentions, but he says okay to this. And then Bacon realizes that the Queen would probably catch on if the tone of his letters is suddenly very, very different. So he has a better plan, and he fakes a whole correspondence between Essex and his own brother, Anthony Bacon. And then he leaks these fake letters to the Queen. And in them, Essex is saying he's a broken man and only Her Majesty can rescue me. And it actually works. And within a few months, she releases Essex. But the problem is then Essex again gets hot-headed and threatens that if she doesn't renew his monopoly on sweet wines, he's going to turn on her. And once again, Queen Elizabeth is furious, and she breaks with Essex, and she kind of blames Bacon a lot. And Essex is once again going to be on trial, and Bacon turns really nasty against him. And I think he's angry that he wasn't listened to. And obviously he's bearing the brunt of this. And so he's saying all these things in the court, and Essex is like, in front of the court, you didn't seem to hate me so much when you were ghostwriting these letters for me. And it's sort of like a courtroom drama gasp moment where everyone's confused about what's going on. Anyway, we all know what happens to the Earl of Essex, but afterwards, King James takes over, and it's sort of like a new lease on life for Bacon, who had never really done well under Elizabeth. He says, I was born for His Majesty's service. And he's really excited, and he tries to apologize to the Earl of Southampton and making peace with him, saying, I may now safely be that which I was truly before, claiming that it was all a show and that he was never really anti-Essex. Southampton is not interested and does not reciprocate. And Henry Rosalie holds a huge grudge against him. And many, like decades later, when Francis Bacon has his fall from favor, Henry Rosalie is the nastiest and the most vindictive. And he's saying we need to strip him of all of his titles, saying he is unfit to be a constable, much less a nobleman. So for the Henry Rosalie fans in the audience, that's an interesting detail, that he really held a lot of rancor decades later towards Francis Bacon. And that is the conclusion of my tale.
Woo! Well, it's like a TikTok video you just made, isn't it?
Well, I felt like I ran long with Anne of Avisour, so I'm trying to condense it. But they were only taking it. That's only the kind of beginning. That's only the Earl of Oxford overlap stuff. And that was what interested me the most, just because I didn't think that there was any evidence. Like I was like, this guy's not Shakespeare. So we can talk about that now with the remaining time. But I was more interested in what I felt was relevant to our Edward de Vere discourse.
I think maybe the reason that Henry Worsley was so antagonistic is that Bacon also prosecuted him on behalf of Cecil. So it's not just like, Southampton decided he didn't like this guy because he's kind of a goofy idiot. He had really good reason for not.
And also just him going down with the ship with the Essex.
Right, and Bacon flipped. I mean, Bacon had been a supporter of Essex, and then he turns around and he's the prosecutor at the trial, and he's essentially doing what Robert Cecil tells him to do, and that's why Southampton never forgives him. Doesn't he also, in 1606, at the age of 45, get married for the first time to a 13-year-old? Did you trip across that?
Yeah, it's a 14-year-old. Okay.
Oh, well, that makes a difference.
Yes, he's happily married to that young lady.
They weren't happily married.
No, they weren't happily married.
She committed adultery. He found, once he's a very elderly man and he's got only a couple of years to live, he leaves a will where he gives her a lot of stuff and everything that he has, and then he finds out about her adultery, and he does another will where he takes it all away and leaves her just back to what her jointure, and she does well, and then she remarries 11 days after he dies.
Wow.
I don't think they were getting on to.
Ouch. I will just say before we, something that I was curious about is having heard multiple people talk about him as having been sort of like a Rosicrucian, related, like he was kind of helping to put Shakespeare's work out in secret after Edward de Vere's death. I see no evidence for that. I don't think that he was on the same side as Edward de Vere. I think there was some acrimony there. And also, Francis Yates writes about him and the essay, The New Atlantis, as having all these sorts of Rosicrucian undertones. And I was curious about that. And I'd read that book years ago, and I'd kind of assumed that she was right. But I read a better article by, I got to figure out the name of I can't believe I forgot this writer's name. But I wrote a critique of that, and it didn't gel with me because I'd read The New Atlantis, and I was like, this is basically a pretty straightforward pitch for his research college, which is what he's obsessed with his whole life. And he's basically writing a short story saying, wouldn't it be awesome if you gave me money to start my own research college? And so I thought that was pretty prima facie what was going on in that text. And I didn't think that it had, so one of the things that Francis Yates was pointing to was that there's people wearing turbans that have red crosses on them. And that's like a red Rosicrucian red cross, but they are literally being like, we're Christians, we're priests, we're doctors. But the thing is, what I thought was funny reading through The New Atlantis is like everybody's outfit is described. Everybody's outfit is fabulously and flamboyantly described. Somebody's wearing like peach shoes. And so I was just like, there's a lot of clothes being talked about in this short story. And I don't think that the small detail of the red cross on the guy's white turban this is like a Bob Mackie production. And I didn't think that it was actually that related to Rosicrucianism.
Phoebe, do you have a view as to why it is that Bacon emerged by the earliest part of the 20th century, say just before the case for Oxford came into?
Yeah, I think there was a
why did he emerge as the leading alternative candidate? Why him?
Why him? So I think there was this manhunt, and they were looking for somebody who was around the same age as Will of Stratford, which he was. Being 11 years younger than Edward de Vere, and they were looking for somebody that had a proximity to court. And he also, in his writings, he writes about cryptography, and he alludes to, I've talked about his work in espionage, and he talks about writing in codes and ciphers and things like this. And so I think that was really exciting to people, that there could be this search for all of these codes that were hiding out there. And so that was what leads to all these very smart, accomplished people. This is literally the seeds of the NSA, like the whole, basically there's, during World War II, the Riverbank Laboratories is a group of like librarians who are Shakespeare nerds, and they get enlisted to help decode Purple, which is Japan's version of the Enigma code. So there was a lot of brain power going towards decoding these Baconian ciphers, which people believed were out there. But I think that ends up being a real roadblock for J.T. Loney in 1920 when he releases his book about Edward de Vere, because by this point it's gotten increasingly fanciful in terms of, it's sort of a red herring, or people were getting frustrated. It seems like the promise of the Baconianism and all these ciphers, like, they got their best minds on it, but we're not getting anything. And so then by this point, people think it's kind of a boy who cried wolf thing.
But it is fair to say that Francis Bacon was certainly one of the most prominent intellectuals of the time. Is that fair to say?
But I got to be real. I got to be really honest with you. I was not impressed. Even one of the biographies that I was reading was like, many would say that he accomplished nothing his entire life. Like, weirdly, he ends up being like Lord Keeper. He's in with King James, who I think maybe even just likes him because he can be a fall guy. Like, he's just willing to be like a scapegoat or something. But he's sitting on the throne when James is out, like on progress. So he really makes it to the top of James's administration. He starts off not to be like this person, but he is. I think of him as not amazing. Like, he writes here, I'll read, like, this is for his writing. And I was like, people thought this guy was Shakespeare. Like, he's writing later about ambition, probably referring to the Earl of Essex. And it to me is, well, I don't want to. Ambition is like a collar, which is and humor that make men active, earnest, full of alacrity, and stirring if it not be stopped. But if it be stopped and cannot have its way, it becometh a just, and thereby malign and venomous. I don't mean to be picking on it, but I was like, this is so tautological and boring. Like, the incredible psychological insight that, de Vere and Shakespeare provide, like that soaring expansiveness of the human experience. Like, this guy's just like a geek who's like teaching himself how to tell jokes at court, like, so that he can get ahead. Like, I don't see the poetry in his soul. And maybe I'm wrong. And like, I'm not like, I went in prejudiced against him because the first encounter I really had with Bacon, obviously having heard about him a lot, was I was reading about Walter Raleigh, who I found impressive, and like to be kind of, I think, who actually Francis Bacon, people say Francis Bacon is this like amazing Renaissance man who tries and innovates all these things. And I think Walter Raleigh was that guy, much more so than Bacon. And he's basically out there prosecuting Bacon in this hideous kangaroo trial, which is a horrific miscarriage of justice, which I think honestly impacts has horrific, like the whole new world. I think if Walter Raleigh had been able to kind of captain the way that the new world was, so that it wasn't so extractive and plunderous, like we would have living in a totally different world if Walter Raleigh had been allowed to go free. And Francis Bacon was just, I was like, nothing is truer than truth. Like, Shakespeare's about truth. Edward de Vere is about truth. He must have hated this guy Bacon, who's just a fake. He's just a phony. He's a fed. Like, I just don't like this guy.
He was Anne Bacon and Nicholas Bacon's second son, right? And I think his dad died and he didn't get very much money. Everything went to Anthony. And so, probably a lot of that scrambling. He had horrible debt too, right? He was just racked.
He's crazy. Yeah, he's a disaster.
Yeah, he sounds to me like one of those, there's some very, very fine minds that are super smart, but it's too much noise. They can't distill anything because the thoughts are disorganized. It's like brilliant ideas, but no structure to hold them and develop them. And he's a very pitiful character in many ways. He also, his fall from grace, right? He gets brought up on countless charges of graft for his legal work. Now,
I think they just smell weakness and people hate him.
He never recovers from that. He gets really tossed to the curb.
Here's what I'll say. This is his most impressive feature. His unbelievable stick-to-itiveness and resilience. He is even like the whole concept of the winding stair, which is the name of the biography that what's her name, Bonner?
Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah,
lady, very fine historian, by the way, Daphne Amari. And somebody else in a comment mentioned that too. That's a very good. I think I like the book, and I like her take on it. But of course, it's a little different from yours, Phoebe. So we're interested in hearing what you have to say.
No, please, please, I'm throwing it to you. But I guess I just, that quote about the winding staircase, and it's, what is it? Life success starts. Basically, anybody who achieves success, it's not a straight staircase; it's a winding staircase. And so he hits so many roadblocks. He never gives up. He overcomes absolutely everything that he can to try and achieve his dream, which is to create what he believes in. And so he is a very persistent character who is high-minded in that regard.
We also have to give him credit for the way he died, right? Because he was trying to preserve a deceased fowl that was going to become dinner by packing it with snow, and essentially the precursor to putting your chicken in the freezer and eating it later. And he says that he contracts an illness from being out in the cold. It was obviously some type of virus, just made worse by being out in the snow and the cold, ill-prepared for a long period of time. When he had caught the virus, at least that's what our medicine today would say. And
it's a good way to go. It's a good way to go. It speaks.
But that is that forward momentum towards science. I mean, trying, experimenting. Tom is, I believe, the only scientist in the group here, but you have to respect him for that, don't you think, Tom?
Well, absolutely. And one thought I had earlier was, and actually, Phoebe, you sort of spoke against this, how much they packed into their lives at that time. I'm just so surprised to hear all the adventures and the intrigues and so on and so forth. But as far as Bacon is concerned in the scientific world now, he's supposed to have invented the scientific method. Okay, fine. But apart from that, he really doesn't get terribly much recognition, which I want to then tie into a comment here in a Q&A. Phoebe, you're probably the best one, but everybody jump in. What's the
I've talked a lot, so I'll cede to someone else.
Okay. What's the best in-depth biography of Bacon? What would you say, Phoebe or anybody?
Bonner, you want to talk about the Daphne book?
Well, actually, I would answer that question in an antique, now antique books written, published around 1850, around the middle of the 19th century by James Spedding. I think they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 volumes. They have everything that Bacon wrote. They have all his letters. They have everything and anything about him. Though there may be, and it's by James Spedding, Spedding, and I've seen them at the library at Rice University, and they're awesome. All these volumes, and I have never picked them up because it just scares me too much. But if you really want to know about Bacon, you need to bite the bullet, I think, and read all that. Now, they may or may not, and see how Spedding thought he was great. And I'm sure that's the point of view of Bacon that would be taken. And of course, there are newer views that Phoebe has, and it's really good to get this other side of it. So I'm just saying, if I were going to really get into Bacon, I would start with James Spedding's stuff and read everything and see how he frames it, and then go take it from there. But because I've never really delved into Francis Bacon that much, I did read the formidable. This is what she looked like, Daphne Mario. She scared me too. But one of the interesting things is, and I just thought today I need to write it up, because it's in her book and I haven't read it anywhere else, that in the Bodleian Library of at Oxford University in 1976, she says now, they had where they had taken 16 plays, quartos, of which 7 are Shakespeare quartos, 2 are from unknown writers, 2 are Marstons, 2 are Ben Jonsons, and they were all compiled into one big volume. And as at that time, they were at Oxford's, they were at the Bodleian Library. And I would love to see somebody go there and look at them if they're still there, if that volume is still there. I need to write it up and send it. It would have been, if I'd done this earlier, Alec, I'd been submitting it to you, but now I need to.
You'd be submitting it to Heidi.
To Heidi now. Yeah, I need to do that because, and thank you so much for all you've done for us over the many years of editing coaching. You're, by the way, such a wonderful editor to work for. Let me do a shout out right here while I have the chance. But it needs to be known that this was there, and I'd sure like to know if any marginalia is in it. But that's the only place I've ever seen it referred to is in Daphne du Maurier's book. And I just like to know more about these. The volumes that he had, only one was of the Shakespeare 7 quartos, was a first edition, and that was of King Lear. All the rest were much later editions. For example, Richard II, he had the quarto from 1614, which was a much later quarto. It's just sort of, I know that maybe I'm getting too much of the weeds here, but I'll write it up as best I can and let people have the information and they can cogitate on it.
Yeah, I think when you shared that he didn't own a first folio, that's
and he doesn't, apparently not, because du Maurier tracks down the books and where they went to and where his papers went to and all that is in her book. So
I hope everyone is looking at the chat here. Lorenzo said, Alfred Dodd's bio, the personal life story of Francis Bacon. Best bio. I don't know if anybody knows that one, but I wanted to give a shout out. Thanks, Lorenzo. And then also I want to recognize Jens, who is joining us from Germany, where it's probably close to 2 a.m. or something. Can you talk about what actually speaks for Bacon as Shakespeare, which I think is a good point for every people who want to jump in on this, to say, yes, although we're recognizing these people under the guise of who are those guys, we're not really convinced that they are viable candidates. Would anybody like to speak to that? Alex, is that fair for you?
Well, off the top of my head, certainly the fact that Bacon was extremely knowledgeable about the law, and so was Shakespeare. So you've got a legal connection right at the very top. Bacon certainly was a prolific writer on all kinds of subjects, although not known for any dramatic works, but certainly was skilled at putting words together and things like that. And certainly was no question that he had some kind of talent. Maybe he was a dreamer, but certainly a talented individual with wide-ranging interests.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that Phoebe really spoke to it. I think it's the fascination with ciphers and that, the sort of digging through things that can be imagined. I went on both the Marlovian website and the Baconian website in preparation for this because I wanted to, see what they had to say. And the Baconian website has papers that are very interested in the cryptology within the works of the Bard. So they will look at finding Bacon's name diagonally across several lines of poetry. Yet, apart from the 2 poems he wrote his 14-year-old wife, I didn't see that he was a poet either. I didn't see that, unless Bonner says he was, and I missed it, but I didn't see it.
No, I read somewhere, and forgive me because I can't remember where, because I don't offer myself as a textual expert like some of you. I just do history stuff. But that Bacon is noted by the textual people as being a master of word and sentence structure and architecture. And Shakespeare is known as being a lyric poet, which is basically backing up what Dorothea just said. And that's out there. And there's no real lyric poetry if you were to get the big picture of Bacon, which obviously I haven't done, but I'm just quoting what I've read. So, I would go with that.
His writing is also, it's very technical legal writing. It is not beautiful, lyric, creative, spiritual, human interest, understanding the depths of the human soul. I mean, there is nothing like that in anything that he wrote. And I think that's because his heart was the heart of a scientist, an experimental scientist who was pushing the edge of what was known at the time, for which he deserves enormous credit, even if he couldn't get the money. Speaking to scientists who are always looking for grants in order to do their experiments. I mean, Bacon had suffered through this 400 years ago.
Yeah, very
Yep.
good. We are very close to the end, and unless anybody has anything else to say, oh yes, comment here. This would be Bob P., probably Proctor, I don't know. A rare opportunity. Resurgence Theatre in Atlanta is performing up to 6 Marlowe plays this summer. They did a fine job with Tamburlaine. Tamburlaine 2 is next. I must say, after seeing some of those excerpts from the plays in that class I took, if anybody does Marlowe anywhere, I will be up for watching it. Faustus, I guess, is the one that's done the most. But
that's an interesting point that among the very, very few Elizabethan dramatists whose works are still being performed, in addition to Shakespeare, Marlowe.
Yeah.
Ben Jonson's plays don't get performed too often, do they?
Not really. I was in The Alchemist once, if you've ever seen that.
Were you?
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that I find Bacon and Marlowe to be complete opposites, which is one of the reasons I was so excited about putting this program together here in our little pub. If Marlowe is all fire and creativity and dangerous friends and living kind of on the edge, and I don't really give a damn, I'm going out and spying and I'm writing these plays that are groundbreaking, and I'm going to get into fights in taverns and get stabbed or disappear. You'll never know. Bacon, I think I see as this, I don't want to take any risks. And that's his mom, right? Who, by the way, kind of lost it later in her life. And Cook Bacon actually lost her mind in her later years, which is really sad because she's quite a driving intellect. But he is the opposite of Marlowe. If Marlowe is, gung-ho, male, macho, I see Bacon as kind of like this, I don't want to take any risks here. I need the money. I can't. And then he starts in on the graft and gets himself in trouble after trouble after trouble after trouble, but not for being brave and creative.
So on that note, if we were in England right now, you would hear a bell ring and the landlord will be saying, "Time, gentlemen, please. All your glasses, please." We're at the end of the show. This was so much fun. Thank you, everyone. Great to see you again. Thank you for all of you who attended this live, and I hope more will see it when it's on YouTube. So many wonderful comments here along the side that I hope people enjoyed as well. So we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Till next time.